Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? In keeping with talking about my new game of D&D, I wanted to go over races really briefly. As I said before in talking about classes, I'm not going to limit you to a certain class when you play a race, and depending on the campaign, and even then, I'd let you do it. It's just going to be kind of difficult or unusual to play certain classes if you're a certain race. Other than that, I've made some simple changes to them. I've tried to make them even simpler than they were. Part of what I've done is used a kind of a skill system, which I'll talk about because it's simple, but it's a little weird. It's a little kind of an amalgam of like first edition and D20 sort of, with a lot of Lamentations of the Flame Princess sort of idea. And so like the races themselves have different skills that they're just plain old good at. And so they'll get like bonuses to those skills, which is not all that unusual because you think of like elves being better at, say, searching, or dwarves being better at removing traps, or noticing like weird stonework type things. You think of like things like halflings or gnomes being not quite so good at climbing because they're teeny. And so I'm using the basic races you think of when you think of D&D: humans and half elves and elves and dwarves and half orcs and halflings, if I didn't say that already, and gnomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about gnomes because I've done something a little bit interesting with those. And of course, like, the various races of like infravision, I kind of went down a little bit on some of the powers or extra types of stuff you would think with them in terms of some of their to-hit rolls or being better with swords or whatever. Yeah, and once again, that's a campaign-based thing because some of them might be a little bit different in terms of that. But I haven't made them like uber powerful, so to speak. The other thing I really like is what Tetsubo57 did with some of the names. He had a video, I can't remember the name of it, but coming up with some different names for some of the races. Things like, gnomes and elves and dwarves. Yeah, that's okay. And of course, humans, well, you should call them humans. And something like half-elves, that sounds kind of weird to call them half-elves. So I forget what kind of name he came up with. I was thinking of something like Alari, and I like the idea of like a half-elf race that was kind of created a long time ago. Like at one point, elves and humans were interbreeding freely, and now they're not. So there's this race that kind of has its own society, breeds true. If an elf or a human were to breed with one of them, excuse me, they're going to come up with a half-elf or an Alari. Orcs, he was kind of thinking about calling like orcs Uruks and half-orcs. Orcs, I kind of reversed that. I like the idea, almost token-esque, of the Uruks being the half-orc type people and the orcs being just orcs. And again, I like them to kind of have their own society and breed sort of true, and at least if they interbreed with a human, they're probably going to get a half-orc or an Uruk. If you breed with an orc, it's probably going to get an orc. So the orcish genes are kind of strong. Halflings, he came up with a name like Peck, actually, I think it might have been from Willow. And I think that's a kind of a cool name. And, nothing wrong with calling gnomes gnomes. As far as gnomes go, I really, kind of enamored with the D20 or Pathfinder gnome, which was a lot more fey and magical. But at the same time, I really like the old first edition gnome, where they're more of like an underground race and can kind of communicate with the burrowing mammals and whatnot. So the shtick I've been using for gnomes for a while, and I finally decided to incorporate this into my campaign, is that gnomes are kind of these weird magical creatures that become like the area that they live in. So there's going to be earth gnomes and forest gnomes. And should one of those gnomes actually switch the area they live in, they're going to become more and more like that. And so their little special, teeny, not very consequential magic abilities are going to change in terms of that. So I like that kind of weird shtick that gnomes might have. The only thing I've really done differently in terms of like ability scores is I totally abandoned the idea of like they're going to have +1 of this ability and -1 of that ability. And instead, I decided to go ahead and have some racial maximums, but really simple ones. And what I pretty much decided on is that given races, outside of like half-elves and humans, are going to have like one ability score where they can only have a 15 as their highest score, so they're at the top end of +1, unless something really wild happens. So elves, would be Constitution. That's not, all that unusual. Dwarves, they put down for dexterity, which, you still think of dwarves as being able to, make all these gems and whatnot, but I kind of gave them an out in terms of being better at, like, tinkering, and, they call the skill. So they can do things with their fingers a little bit better, so it kind of evens that sort of thing out. And, half-orcs with charisma, which is kind of standard. And then things like, halflings and gnome strength, because they're teeny. And if you're a 3.5 foot really jacked guy, you're just not going to be as strong as a 6.5 foot jacked guy because you don't weigh anywhere near what he does. He may weigh 3 times as much as you do. So they're not going to be that strong. Otherwise, I haven't done an awful lot with that because I like a lot of fluff when it comes to races. I like, you to play the race a little bit differently, and maybe there's going to be some advantages and disadvantages to being certain races given the campaign. There's certainly going to be places in my world where humans are going to be so dominant and so prejudicial that if you're a demi-human, you may in fact need to buy a pass to go into that city and do business and everything. It's a little terrible, but it's the idea of the society is being that prejudicial, and perhaps if you're in some of the elven areas, the elves are so they don't like the other races at all. They feel very superior, so they're not going to really be nice to anybody. They're really going to look down on everybody. So that sort of fluff, and just various little things, because just like the classes, I think all the other little fluff pieces, if you will, rather than mechanical pieces, make those races kind of interesting, and give it more of that racial flavor. I know some people say, hey, look, if you don't make an elf too different than a human, then it's just a human in an elf suit. And like I've said before, we are humans in elf suits, okay? We're already playing that. So I really still like the idea of, doing things, more in role-playing and fluff, again, if you will, to make the races different than a lot of mechanical stuff. So that's pretty much what I'm doing with races. I'm keeping it super simple. And one other thing I would say, though, about the racial maximums is I don't do any kind of ability score maximums for female characters because I think that's really crappy. Because let's face it, most often when somebody wants to play a female character, it's because they're a female player, and they just feel more comfortable doing that. To tell a woman that they're only going to have a 15 strength at the maximum, no matter what they're playing, is a really, well, I can't say the word, but that's a crappy thing to do. That's just stupid, and let's not do that.